Byzantine Stories, Episode 3. Porphyrius the Charioteer. Part 1. The Spectacles.
The emperor and the factions erected the statue of Porphyrius, son of Calchas, loaded with many crowns won by skilled toil, the youngest of all the drivers as well as the best, and winner of as many victories as any. This man's statue should have been of gold, not of bronze like the others.
When I'm researching the podcast narrative, or the end of the century tours, I often come across tiny references to lives that sound really interesting. But there isn't any more information about them beyond this fleeting mention of their existence. It was these brief glimpses of lives that inspired the Byzantine Stories series. I wondered if I could put together a collection of short stories just referencing these people that otherwise would be ignored in the overall sweep of the Roman epic. Our series began with the opposite of that. John Chrysostom was covered by all contemporary historians. He had his own biographers, and of course much of his own writing survived. Though we know far less about Simeon the Stylite, he too had multiple books written about him. Today, we come to one of those people who we know almost nothing about, Porphyrius the Charioteer. And yet, this is part 1 of 2. How can someone we know nothing about get 2 episodes to himself? Porphyrius lived in the late 5th and early 6th century, right at the start of the History of Byzantium narrative. He was probably born in Zeno's reign and died in Justinian's. There is just one mention of him in the histories. In 507, he is in Antioch, a star charioteer leading the Green faction in a very nasty riot. That's it. That's all we would know from traditional Byzantine literature. As you know, the vast majority of what survives are either religious texts or political histories, neither of which are very interested in chariot racing. The church was never a fan of the public spectacles because they encouraged people to indulge in sinful passions, while the political historians focused on matters of state. The only time public entertainers make the headlines are when they are starting riots or sleeping with the emperor. Porphyrius would simply be forgotten if it weren't for 2 other sources: a collection of Greek poems and some statue bases dug up in Istanbul. These finds have allowed modern historians to reconstruct the life of Porphyrius, not in the technicolor with which we could illuminate John Chrysostom, but in solid black and white lines at least. Suddenly, Porphyrius is no longer a shapeless jockey. He's a child prodigy, a political pawn, a thug, a war hero, a huge celebrity. In part 2, I will take you through the historical detective work which was necessary to uncover this fascinating tale. But before we can imagine him into life, we need to know more. We can only resurrect him if we also recreate the world he lived in. The spectacles, the dancers, the hippodrome itself, the blues and greens, and the relationship between politics and sport. That's why this is part 1 of 2. In this episode, we need to trace the history of Byzantine public spectacles from their early Roman origins. Only then can we fully understand the fragments that make up Porphyrius' story. And that story will come in part 2. It might seem like a long road to travel just to see a black and white sketch of a life, but the fact that we can even see that is a wonder in itself. And besides, Part of the goal of the Byzantine Stories series is to explore daily life. And if you asked an urban Roman what was the most exciting thing coming up on his calendar, there's a very good chance he'd reply, the races. And now the signal was given, and the bolts flew back with a noise. Scarcely had the first hoof flashed into full view when a wild storm of shouting rose up to heaven. Bending forward like the drivers, each man gazed at the chariot he favoured, and at the same time shouted to the flying horses. The course was shaken by the enthusiasm of the spectators, and excitement robbed every man of his senses. A cloud of yellow dust rose up from the sandy soil, concealing with its darkness the running of the horses and the exertions of the drivers. And now, when near half the distance was completed, they quickened over the course, and spirited Pancartes, struggling to catch up the team ahead, seemed to rise higher and at each moment to mount upon the chariot in front, and the hoofs of his prancing forefeet struck and rattled on the car of the Galician horse. When Hiberus saw that the Galician team was tiring, he leaned forward quickly and stirred up Pancartes, who was chafing at being second in the race, and plied his whip, even while he called to the horse, "Steed of Asturia, shall any other get in front and win the prize when you are competing? Rise up and fly, and glide over the plain with all your wonted speed, as if on wings." Durius pressed on along the plain, and increased the pace of his team by the whip, nor was the effort in vain. Coming up on the right, he seemed to be running neck and neck with his rival. Then, amazed by the prospect of such glory, he cried out, "Now, Pelorus, now is the time to show that the west wind was your sire. Let steeds that spring from the loins of mere animals learn how far superior is the issue of an immortal parent." And indeed, had he not, even while he spoke, been beguiled by too great success and by his fearful joy into dropping his whip, Durius would perhaps have consecrated to the west wind the altars he had vowed. But now, as wretched as if the victor's wreath had fallen from his head, he turned his rage against himself, tearing the gold-embroidered garment from his breast, and weeping and pouring out complaints to heaven. When the lash was gone, the team no longer obeyed the driver. In vain he flogged their backs with the reins for a whip. Meanwhile Pancartes, sure now of victory, sped on to the goal and claimed the first prize with head held high. A light breeze fanned the mane that rippled over his neck and shoulders. Then, with proud step, he raised his nimble limbs, and a great shout greeted his victory. That description of a chariot race comes from Silius Italicus. He was writing about the games thrown by Scipio Africanus at New Carthage in 206 BC. Chariot racing goes back a long way in Greek and Roman culture. In Homer's Iliad, races were held as part of funeral games alongside traditional athletic competitions. And throughout the long history of Rome under the kings and the Republic, chariot racing remained one of the most popular spectacles. When sufficient men and money were available to put them on.